Hello, everyone. This is your host, Dandan, and this is Descent. And today we're having a repeat guest on. One of my favorite guests to have ever had on is Professor Adrian Moore. Hi, Professor. Say hello to everyone.
Hi, and thanks ever so much for that really kind invitation, and I appreciate it. It's great to have a chance to chat with you again.
Yeah, of course. Last time we spoke, of course, we went over, of course, what's the word that I'm specifically looking for? It wasn't just infinity. Do you remember, Thomas? We spoke about a specific professor that his
Cantor.
Cantor. You spoke a lot about Cantor's notion of infinity last time.
ALF null, ALF zero, all that stuff.
All
Uh-huh.
of that fun stuff.
hmm
Um, for those who don't know, who are watching in the chat right now, Professor Moore specifically focuses on infinity. You have a whole video series on infinity. What are some of the, just for the basic parameters, like the basic information people should know about the topic of the philosophy of infinity to begin with?
So uh, maybe I can answer that question in terms of this brilliant mathematician Cantor, who is one of the pioneering figures in the history of thought about infinity. He is a 19th century figure. And in mathematical terms and in philosophical terms, that means that he's a comparatively recent figure, because obviously these are disciplines that have been going for hundreds of years, in fact, for thousands of years. Um, but Cantor worked in the 19th century, and he was the first person who really showed that you can do precise, rigorous mathematical work with the idea of infinity. Mathematicians had always been interested in infinity, and infinity had always been lurking in the background of what they were doing. But Cantor did something special. Cantor came along and said, look, I'm going to make infinity a focus of attention in its own right, um, and asked how you could do rigorous mathematics about the infinite. And he came up with some remarkable discoveries, and in particular, the thing that blows most people's minds when they first come across it is that he discovered that there are different orders of infinity. You can have one infinite collection and another infinite collection, and nevertheless, one of them can be bigger than the other. There's some kinds of infinity that are bigger than other kinds of infinity. So it was quite revolutionary work. It transformed the way in which people think about infinity. And it was work of the highest mathematical caliber. He was a brilliant mathematician.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the reason that I'm banging on about him, I mean, there's plenty more that could be said about him, obviously, and I'd be happy to answer any specific questions that you might have about him and about his work. But one of the really interesting things about Cantor is that yes, he was a brilliant mathematician. He was also deeply religious. And he was interested in the idea of infinity from a theological point of view, just as much as he was from a mathematical point of view. And in
Okay.
fact, he believed that his mathematical abilities were a gift that had been given to him by God, that enabled him to make the idea of infinity precise, and therefore enabled theologians to work with an idea of infinity that could be precise as well. So you've got both strands there in Cantor. You've got the emphasis on the mathematical side, and you've got the interest and commitment to the religious side as well.
That's always interesting, because recently I was having a discussion with someone about like these notions of God, right? Where it's like, if you have different scales of infinity, right? Like you have bigger infinities, smaller infinities. Does this somehow relate to notions of like an omnipotent God versus a maximally powerful God, where they're both infinite but different in a way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've sort of put your finger on it actually, because what happened in his mathematical work was that he said, "Look, there are all these different orders of infinity. There are different infinite sizes, and in fact, there are infinitely many different infinite sizes. There are infinitely many different orders of infinity." But, said Cantor, there's something which he was prepared to call the absolute infinite that transcends even all of that. So you can do rigorous mathematical work up to a point, but eventually you get something that's so great that you can't
Hmm.
even measure it any longer. And, or I mean, there's even a question about whether you can coherently talk about it any longer. But this was part of what he was getting at, because he thought that this was the kind of infinity that was appropriate for talking about God. Um, and his mathematical work had sort of pointed in that direction, but pointed in that direction is the operative phrase, because that was as much as he thought you could do. So God's infinity is infinity with a capital I. That goes way beyond anything else. That was Cantor's view, and you
So,
can't do serious mathematical work investigating God's infinity.
so a lot of people's notion of infinity, so this is where I'm like a little bit confused, because at the one hand you said God's infinity is this unmeasurable, like unconceivable thing, but
Yeah,
then I know a lot of people's notion of God for a long time has been that which is like logic is God, logos is God, right? It is a thing that is bound by a set of rules, like
yeah,
one cannot equal two if that's logically impossible. God cannot do that. So how is
yeah,
that boundless in the sense? Like, so when
yeah.
Cantor is talking about God, is he talking about this boundless notion of God, or is he talking about this bound notion of God that can be conceived within an infinity?
Well, this this is a recurring debate among theologians. Is God so great that he or she or it um, even transcends logic, or is God bound by logic?
Hmm.
And I mean that's been a huge debate among theologians for hundreds of years. Um, so I mean that's a really good question, a really interesting question. Cantor himself would have seen God as bound by logic, um, and you might well think, well, isn't that a really significant concession? Doesn't that mean that there's something that's even bigger than God?
Yeah.
I mean, if God was really infinite with a capital I, then surely God wouldn't be bound by anything. Um, so how do theologians square that circle if they're on that side of the debate? How do they explain that God can be bound by logic? Um, well, it's a tricky problem, obviously. But one of the things that they do is they say, well, it's not really a kind of bind. I mean, we say bound by logic, but if for example, if you tried to envisage God making it rain and not rain at the same time, and if you say no, not even God can do that, uh, it's not really a restriction on God, because the view, in a way, is that it is raining and not raining at the same time doesn't even make sense.
Hmm.
Um, you're not, there's not a genuine task there that you're setting before God. So if you say that God can't make it rain and not rain at the same time, that's a little bit like saying that God can't make it the case that flump ix ok uk, just sheer gibberish.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
Because like in the Old Testament, God lights a bush on fire and it's burning while it's also not burning simultaneously, right? So why would those negations even constrict him in like a or them or
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so that's a debate as well, isn't it? I mean, we could go back over the scriptures and ask ourselves whether that really is um, what the scriptures are trying to convey, that something was true and false at the same time. I mean, an alternative would be that no, God isn't actually breaking the laws of logic in that scenario. God is breaking the laws of nature, and
okay,
that's a very different matter. So what you've got
interesting.
there is you've got a bush that is on fire in the sense that it's consumed by flames, but it's not actually burning. That the bush isn't burning away at the same time, and that's logically possible. It's not a natural possibility in the normal course of events. That doesn't happen. Maybe God occasionally intervenes and alter alters the laws of nature for some specific purpose, and I guess that would be what most people would call a miracle.
I see. Without going too much into the whole God thing, I guess it just came into my
Yeah.
mind because I recently talked about that. Um,
Uh-huh.
we also spoke about something last time, which I really liked, which was, and I've been pondering it ever since. It's been in my head. This idea that in order to do philosophy properly, you kind of have to step into the shoes of a child,
Yeah.
to step into the
Yeah.
shoes of someone who kind of sees
Yeah.
the world not as already defined by things that they've understood, but rather by the limitless of being able to imagine or create anything. Right, Alpha
Yeah.
and Omega sitting on the shoulders of giants.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And you said that you come across it because of your conversations with children as well. A lot of the times you find that.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate about that before we move on to the next question that I have been preparing all these months for?
I mean, I'd love to elaborate on that because that's one of my favorite themes. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, what happened last time was that right at the very beginning of the conversation, you asked me to say a little bit about my own interest in philosophy and a
Hmm.
little bit about what I thought philosophy was. And I think pretty much the first thing that I said, or one of the very first things that I said, was that I think of a philosopher as somebody who's never grown up. What we do is we ask the sorts of questions that children ask, um, and I've often thought this. I mean, it's a bit glib, I know, but I think there is a lot of truth in it. I mean, anybody that's been around a really young child who's just beginning to talk and think about their environment will know that the one thing that they keep doing is asking why. You present them with some bit of information, they want to know why. You try to explain why, and they want to know why that explanation counts. And
Hmm.
and you can never satisfy them. Everything that you come up with prompts a further why. And so philosophers are a bit like that. I mean, we're people that have that sort of childlike sense of wonder, I think. What is going on here? Uh, why should it be that way? Why should we be constrained by logic? Why isn't it possible for it to rain and not rain at the same time? Who
Hmm.
says? Really, really, really fundamental questions, and these are questions that young children ask. I mean, as I say, I'm thinking of small children, but there's also a sense in which we're adolescents that have never grown up, because there's that later phase that people go through as well. They're not children any longer, but they're still young people, and all those issues that adolescents wrestle with. Uh, what's what's the point of it all? How do I work out what my identity is and how I fit into all of this? Those issues are issues that philosophers never tire of thinking about as well.
I mean, and those are, of course, existentialist questions, questions about society, whether I fit with what is the role of society in my life. These are also philosophical questions that people deal with.
Yeah.
Um, but this is something that made me think. We want to encourage this like childlike curiosity, right? This childlike approach to philosophy in the world. At what point do you see that it's maybe too much, where people are now no longer being able to deal with their day-to-day life? They aren't able to make sense of reality anymore because they doubt even that, like they consistently are I'm thinking of, who am I thinking of? There's this notion of a um I think it's like a man of faith and a man of full resignation. I don't remember which philosopher talked about these
Oh,
issues.
this is Kierkegaard, I think.
Kierkegaard,
Yeah,
yes, yes,
yeah.
yes. And at what point does philosophy become like, oh, I'm a man of full resignation. I'm no longer acting in the world as if it's like a thing to do. Like, let's say we talk about infinity. I think we spoke about how it can even be a nonsensical topic to talk about, and you have to engage it in the proper way. Do you see a remedy for this problem, or do you even see that it is a problem? Am I hiding it or anything, or no?
Well, I think there is a problem. I think there is a problem. It's all very well questioning everything, but you sooner or later have to get out and engage with the world, and philosophers are not necessarily the best people to do that. I mean, it would be really bad news if everybody was a philosopher. I think there's room for some of us, but there's not room for too many of us. But there are ways in which it can be quite debilitating, I think. And interestingly, I've just read, or I've almost finished reading, a biography written by a guy called David Edmonds,
Hmm.
who, I don't know if that name's familiar to you, but he'd be a great person for you to interview, actually. But it's a biography of um, a 20th century Oxford philosopher, Derek Parfit. I don't know if you're familiar with
I'm
Derek
not
Parfit.
familiar with that guy. No.
No, but so he was uh, um, a philosopher who spent all his career in Oxford in the UK. Um, and is reckoned by many people to be one of the most brilliant thinkers. And he published some very influential work in ethics. But it's a striking biography, because David Edmonds, the writer, depicts a man who's becoming more and more obsessed and more sort of introverted, and turning in on himself. And you see him sort of slowly losing a lot of his very basic social skills. Um, because he's so preoccupied with these basic philosophical issues. And you get the impression that there's something positively detrimental about um, spending too much time doing philosophy. I mean, it's a really extreme case, but it's a revealing case. Um, I don't know. I don't know whether it's a problem that's peculiar to philosophy. I mean, I could well imagine a biography of a lot of other academics in other disciplines who suffer the
Hmm.
same fate. I mean, anybody that just spends a lot of time thinking about one issue or one set of issues, there's always a chance that they're going to lose touch with reality. And I don't know whether it's going to be a special issue just because they're philosophical questions, but nevertheless, Derek Parfit is a striking case, and I think if you look back over the history of philosophy, you'd find other examples, people that did brilliant philosophical work, but it didn't necessarily stand them in good stead as far as their the daily grind of life was concerned.
That's because the reason why I bring this up is because what I think, I mean, at least from what I'm seeing, is that we're at a place in society where, with the access to information that everybody has, and we are, we're also sharing on a Discord right now, and the communities that I end up communicating is hundreds and thousands of people who deal with these philosophical questions. But it seems like a lot of people are also struggling with recognizing basic truths about the world, whether it be like, we know recently there was the United States primary debate, the Republican debate, where they're on stage saying defund education, climate change is a hoax, it's not real,
Yeah.
COVID never really happened. Like, are these outgrowths of like having this serious notions of resignation about the world, consistently asking why, and almost like maintaining your childhoodness, where like Santa is real and your grandfather is not really a real person because they live in a different state? Like, are we still in that? Is it forcing that childhood state? Do you see any connection? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think you're raising a really, really interesting issue, and it's one that, as a professional philosopher, I do find quite concerning, actually, because I mean, I'd love to be able to say I'd love to be able to say that philosophy is an antidote to some of the problems that you're talking about. But there is the risk that it actually aggravates the problem rather than helps to solve the problem. Because if you're encouraging people to be skeptical all the time, and if you're encouraging people to ask why, and if you're encouraging people not to bow down to authority, um, well, that's fine. But then, in particular, you're going to find that there are people who are skeptical about climate change, or who say, well, I'm not going to accept that human beings are responsible for climate change just because the experts tell me that.
Yes.
You know, you, the philosopher, have told me that I mustn't kowtow to anybody. So, okay, I'm not going to kowtow to anybody. I'm not going to kowtow to the scientific experts. So, so it's a real issue, and all I can do really is say that I mean, those of us that are involved professionally, we just have to be very self-conscious about this. I mean, I like to think that um, philosophy can make a positive contribution, and that in fact, what happens when all goes well is that you have your skepticism, you're prepared to ask all these questions,
Mm-hmm.
but you think it through critically, um, and you actually ideally come to an even better understanding of why it is important what the experts say, and um, their expertise does count for something. But I agree. I think as I say, I think you put your finger on a really interesting problem, and I think it's a genuine practical problem. I mean, I'd be interested to know what you guys think about this. If you think specifically, if you think about something like um, skepticism about climate change, um, what is motivating that? I mean, I suppose all sorts of things are motivating it. I mean, one thing that's motivating it is perhaps short-sighted selfishness. I mean, it's
For sure. I mean, I definitely think it could be a part of it. Uh, Personally, I think that a lot of like, at least from like a philosophy place, you're always told, oh, when you start out learning philosophy, at least in Western culture, you start out by reading Descartes. Usually, right?
Yeah,
It's the first thing you read, right? Raise all your foundation so you could like make sense of the world. And as you kind of go through this like skeptical framework, I end up finding that like each new era of philosophy is skeptical of the one that has come before it,
yeah,
and kind of like sees what they did wrong, raise some of those foundations, and build anew. And I kind of
yeah,
see the same motif happen from modernism to postmodernism, um, modern to continental to analytical. You consistently see these like different things that they find wrong, or things that were taken for granted, and move forward. And I
yeah,
think in that regard, people like to be the protagonist of a story. They like to be Spider-Man, who finds that they have powers and is unique and is onto something different. And I
yeah,
think in that like main character syndrome, a lot of people find themselves in that, and therefore want to reject authority in the same way that you're a teenager and you reject authority to live your life. You're not going to tell me how to live my life. Well, you're not going to tell me what to think, how to think, because I'm the main character of my own story. I think that has a
yeah,
lot to do with that. And I feel like a lot of times when we're having philosophical conversations, we're not, you're consistently dealing with, how do I think about this issue, as opposed to how do people think about this issue, which I think a
yeah.
lot, and right. So
Yeah, I think that's right, and you might well argue that philosophy aggravates the problem. I mean, as you say, you look back over the history of philosophy, and one by one, philosophers have come along and have disagreed with everybody else, and there's been a yet another major shift of direction. We all used to take this for granted, and nobody does any longer, and in particular. Um, you find that philosophers are prepared to question science.
mhm.
And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Descartes, which is very often people's starting point when they're first studying philosophy. Um, and he asked some fundamental questions about science.
He
Why
did.
should we trust what we can observe as a result of experimentation and so on and so forth. Now, as it happens, funnily enough, Descartes himself was not a genuine skeptic. I mean, his skepticism was purely tactical. Um,
Yeah.
and his own hope was that he could eventually give science a really secure foundation, and that by the time he'd finished, science would be placed on a firmer footing rather than a shakier footing. That was
Yes.
his hope. Um, but the fact remains that he was prepared to ask these fundamental questions about science. So yeah, it's small wonder that people come along today and say, "Well, you're not going to tell me what to think. My views are my views, and it's my right to think whatever I like." That's very often the attitude. Now, I mean, if philosophy can be an antidote to that attitude, um, I think it's because it does encourage critical thinking, but it's got to be um, it's got to be disciplined critical thinking.
Mm.
Uh, just saying, well, I think what I think and you think what you think isn't going to get anybody anywhere. You've got to be able to argue for your case, and you've got to be able to look at the other person's arguments for their case. And if you're going to do that properly, and if you're going to do it carefully, then it shouldn't be all that long before you decide it's not just a question of what I think and what the other guy thinks. There is such a thing as what we should think. Um,
What we
and
should think. Okay. We're
yeah,
getting more into like a normativeness to it,
it-
or
yeah. Um, uh, I mean, these are fundamental questions. These are fundamental philosophical questions, obviously. But the very idea of truth. which again, is one of the things that skeptics will call into question. One of the things that postmodernists will call into question.
What is your conception of truth then? In
Well, I
that
think,
what is your how do you deal with truth as someone who talks and writes about infinity, which is one of
yeah,
the things that's like how do you therefore deal with truth? How do you deal with that?
it's it's a massive question, but I think the thing that I would want to emphasize is that we shouldn't be. I mean, however you answer that question, we shouldn't be afraid of the very idea that there is such a thing as the truth. I mean, I think a lot of people these days are afraid of that idea. They think that that is itself a bit authoritarian. Um, well, who's to say what the truth is? And I've got my truths and you've got your truths. But uh, I, that seems to me to be fruitless. That's not going to lead anywhere. Whereas if you've got a sense of the truth, um, that will also give you a sense that we've got a shared endeavor, a collaborative endeavor. Let's pull together. Let's pool our resources and see if we can try and work out what the truth is. Um, I mean, it can be authoritarian. People can come along and claim that they have the truth, and it's bad news when people do that, and that's as bad as much as they can say.
I mean,
But if they then go on and give argument,
yeah, they go up and give arguments. They go up and give arguments. But I find, at least where I hear the argument, okay, the truth can be authoritarian, is when the truth almost like when we think of it is true. Like in the 1980s, a lot of people would say, oh, it's true that homosexuality is a disorder, for example, or it's true that the place of the black man is to be subservient to the white man. These were scientific truths that were said during our history.
yeah.
So how is a person supposed to navigate that,
Well,
knowing that in history that's how the truth was appealed to?
yeah, yeah. It's a very good question, but in a way, I think it helps uh, bolster my case actually, because
Hmm.
what this goes to show is, I mean, the thing that people are worried about when you talk about the truth, the thing that people are worried about is that the authoritarian tone that goes along with that. But actually, the points that you have just made, the really good points that you have just made, remind us that actually, when you're talking about the truth, what that should do is it should foster a spirit of humility. It shouldn't go along with authoritarianism. It should go along with humility and open-mindedness, because history is littered with examples of things that we used to think and we don't think any longer. Um, so there was a time when the majority view might have been that, I don't know, that homosexuality was a disease of some
Hmm.
kind, or that there was something inherently superior about uh, people who were white over people who were black, and and now far fewer people think in those terms. Now, once upon a time, they might have been described as truths, um, but if we believe in the truth, and if we think that those were bad ways to think, then we can look back over the past and say, well, they were making some errors. They were making some fundamental errors. Um, they hadn't grasped the truth. Um, and let's be humble about this. Let's be open minded about this. Who knows what there is that we now think to
Hmm.
which people will have the same attitude in 100 years' time? Um,
I mean,
So
I do end up saying this a lot as well. Is that the truth, while it's real, is very much a thing that we don't know. It's a thing we
yeah,
approximate, maybe. And as long as we have that type of humility around it, we're consistently able to question it without resignating it, right? In the way
yeah,
that Kierkegaard talked about the night of resignation. Instead of
yeah.
just throwing it away, it's not a thing to throw away. It's a thing to look at and criticize, but also accept as the way in which we've approximated this thing socially and collectively.
To- Totally. No, after you.
Oh, Thomas? We can't. Oh, okay. I can hear you now. Sorry, I couldn't hear
Oh
you.
yeah, it's all good. Science is definitely, in terms of like an anti-real perspective, a bit constructivist. I mean, the models and theories that we create are all us and society, right?
Well,
Um,
it's interesting because I mean, in fact, I was going to go on and make pretty much the same point. I think it is really interesting to think about science in this connection because, um, I mean, a lot of scientists um, would say that they believe in the truth and that that they're trying as hard as possible to discover it.
I think
But
they're probably going for like a correspondence theory of truth or a
um,
criterion of truth.
quite often, I mean, a lot's going to depend on how reflective and self-conscious they are,
Yeah,
I
they
guess.
did a
But
study on like philosophers and philosophy students.
yeah,
45% was correspondence, 21% was deflationary or minimalist, and
uh-huh.
then 14% was epistemic theories of truth.
I mean, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It is interesting, isn't it, when you do surveys of that kind on different groups as well. If you specifically took a bunch of physicists, for example, and found out what their intuitions were, but the reason why I think scientists are particularly interesting in this context is that I mean they might have their own different views about what what the concept of the truth comes to, but a lot of them, the majority of them, I think the vast majority of them, are probably prepared to think in terms of the truth, but they are also um, very open minded.
Hmm.
And they spend all their time um, doing experiments and being critical of one another's work and being critical of their own work, seeing whether their theories stand up to test and so on and so forth. Um, and they would be, I mean, scientists would be the first to admit that things that were taken for granted 100 years ago are now discredited. Um, I mean, things that were taken for
Yeah.
granted by scientists 100 years ago are now discredited. Um, they wouldn't mind admitting that at all. They would be the first to admit that, and they would say, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that's part of the process." We're constantly discovering that it's more complicated than we thought it was, or that we have to go off into this slightly new direction.
Mm.
Um, and like you said, maybe we're never actually going to get there, but at least we can try and get closer and closer. And if you, I mean, picking up on this idea that scientific theories may be social constructs. I mean, if you put that idea to
Well, that's what
scientists,
constructivism says, at least on the
yeah.
analytical side. Yeah.
And I mean, again, it depends which scientists you're talking to, but I think there are quite a few scientists who wouldn't, again, they wouldn't mind admitting that. They might say, "Yeah, my theories are what I've
Yeah.
constructed or what society has
Not the
constructed."
descriptive facts in reality, but the prescriptive facts of the models themselves.
And models is a very good term. I mean, that's a term that they themselves often use, and they
Hmm.
they might well say, yeah, these are just models. This is a way of helping us to think about it, and probably in 100 years' time, there's a good chance that we will have
Yeah.
decided this is a bad way to think about it. But for
Hopefully.
now, this is serving us well. Um,
Yeah.
So we're gonna bring the conversation into a little spicier territory. Um, you're a person, you have been in academia your whole life.
Yeah.
Are you still actively working in academia? Right, you still teach or do act.
Yes, I'm just a few years away from retirement. So yeah, but actually, for academics, even when you've retired, you
You don't
still
really
carry
stop.
on.
Yeah, you still
Yeah,
carry on. So,
yeah.
first of all, congratulations on that. That's just an amazing feat, and I know anybody is lucky to have had a career such as yours and being able to like retire and do the thing you've loved for such a long time. Um, but the spicy place I want to go to, in a lot of places, especially culturally and politically, there's a lot of conversations around academia censoring ideas that they don't like. Do you
Oh
find that
yeah,
to be true? Do you find
yeah.
this notion to actually resonate? Is there this issue for like some ideas, for example, race and IQ, for example, that some people will argue, oh, why is that? Why is no one researching that? Is there no point in research? Is like the marketplace of a university being free dead? What is your feelings and sentiments about that? You're at the end of your road. Do you see a change? Do you see it as detrimental change? What do you think of all these like initiatives that are happening at universities?
Um, yeah, there is a problem. Certain areas of inquiry that people are afraid to enter into. It is a problem because I think as academics we oughtn't to be afraid of anything like that. If there's a legitimate question, then you can um, try and answer it, even if your answer is going to be unpopular. Um, and yeah, I mean, you do find elements of censorship which are disturbing. I think it's exaggerated, um, at least on this side of the Atlantic.
Okay, I think we froze a little bit there, Professor Moore.
I mean,
You
sorry,
lost
I
me.
just was
Yeah, we lost you there for 1 second. You want just going back 10 seconds? You said, "I think it's exaggerated on this side of the Atlantic," and then it cut off.
right. Okay, yeah. So I think there may be a bit of a difference between the UK and the US. I don't know, and it may be more of a problem in the US. And again, I don't know, but in this country, there's a tendency among the some of the popular right wing press to really exaggerate this problem, and they love nothing more than yet another example of some academic who's got unpopular views, whose voice has been shouted down, either literally or metaphorically.
Okay,
Um, and the people that are doing the shouting down are usually portrayed as students rather than other academics. But again, they love to pick up on that and say, oh, here are these soft students, snowflake students, once again showing that they daren't enter into debate about these sensitive issues, and so on and so forth. Um, so you find a lot of examples of this sort of thing in the press. And
hmm
my own view, for what it's worth, is that it probably is telling you a bit more about the press than it is about what's going on in universities. Because I think they
interesting.
just love it. I think they like to sensationalize it. Um, but I don't want to deny that there is a problem. And as I say, it's possible that there's even more of a problem on your side of the
Then,
Atlantic.
then, then, yeah. But you don't
Yeah,
see it as exaggerated as you hear about it on the news in Europe. How about
yeah.
the quality of students coming into university? Do you think education as a whole? Do you find that modern day students are coming in more educated, less educated, like, or they have issues more in writing? Like, what is some of the differences you see between generations of students as they come into university? What's one of been a stark difference that you've seen?
Yeah, it is pretty much what you might expect, actually. Some things that we once could have taken for granted, um, background knowledge that we might once have presupposed, that's going to be part of anybody's basic education.
Hmm.
Um, we do find that there's less and less of that kind that you can presuppose. We were talking earlier about religion and about
Hmm.
the Bible, and there certainly was a time when I would have thought nothing about pulling an example from the Bible, and just taking for granted that my students would know what I was talking about. Um, and now I'm less inclined to do that. Or if I do want to pull an example from the Bible, I'd actually explicitly ask them whether it's familiar to them or not.
I see.
And I mean, that's just one example. Um, uh, there are things that would once have been a standard part of anybody's education that don't any longer play that role. And there are certain basic writing skills that they don't have to the extent that they did. Um, Often our students are not taught basic grammar in a way that they once were, and that's noticeable when they're writing their essays. Um,
Interesting.
but in other respects, they do much better than students in the past used to. And of course, the facility that they have with modern technology, the good ways in which they can exploit IT, and uh, uh, all the things that they can do with computers, and all the ways in which they um, are able to take advantage of the fact that a whole lot is literally at their fingertips. I mean, that comes with dangers as well as advantages, but uh, the best students are able to put these put technology to good effect rather than bad effect.
I see. I see. So
Um,
go ahead, Thomas.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, you didn't say anything. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess it is what you would expect, right? They have more deficits in grammar because we're probably you're much more used to writing on the computer that tries to fix that for you, as
yeah,
opposed to take the time to actually learn it. But because you have the access to all these things, okay, so it's pretty intuitive. It is pretty intuitive.
I think it's pretty much as you would expect. I'm I'm uh, very very lucky in as much well, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, not least because my job is my hobby.
That's
But
amazing. I
but I'm
only wish
also,
one day.
yeah, but I am also lucky in as much as I am I am at an institution that attracts some of the best students. I mean, it's not. I realise that the young people that I'm working with, are not the most representative sample, um, but I am constantly impressed, actually, by how well they do work.
Okay.
Yeah. And they have good critical skills. They are open-minded. All the things that you might hope for in students. Um, and as I say, that may be just because of the particular institution that I'm at, but uh, I don't I don't have many students that I would want to complain about on that score.
I see. I just want to explain to the audience real quick that the reason why I'm streaming this webpage is because we were having technical issues getting the stream to be live for you guys and on pace so you don't lag behind, while also streaming it to YouTube and Rumble and the other platforms. So just know that I am working on a way around that, but right now this is the best we got. So don't worry about it. It's just there for audio. I want to make sure anyhow. But back to the point about students. We are very close to the end of the show, right? We're like an hour in. But I wanted to ask, what are you working on right now specifically? Do you have anything that you're specifically working on?
I've got a number of uh, half-finished projects, actually.
Oh, those are my favorite.
Yeah. So I'm about halfway through an essay that I'm writing on some of the ideas of Wittgenstein, another great 20th century philosopher,
Mhm.
perhaps the greatest 20th century philosopher. As somebody that I've always been interested in, and I always enjoy working on him. Um, but but just this afternoon, I was reading something that I'm going to be responding to in a conference that's coming up,
Okay.
about the idea of inexpressibility, things that can't be put into words. And
Okay. Do you have some sort of words to try to explain these things that cannot be put into words?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Now
that
I'm
is,
not. Now I'm interested. Now I'm interested.
yeah. So that, I mean, that's the basic paradox that anybody that's interested in inexpressibility confronts that paradox. And certainly, if you believe that there is such a thing as inexpressibility, you confront that paradox, because obviously the question immediately arises, well, what are you going to say about it?
Mhm.
And the minute you try and give examples, it looks as if you've undercut yourself, because, oh, well, you've just put it into words. But actually, for what it's worth, I do believe that you can get around that problem. I think you can square that particular circle. I don't know how much I can usefully say about it in the few minutes that are remaining, but maybe I'll say a little bit about it. I mean, one way that you can get around this problem, I think, is if you believe that there's such a thing as inexpressible knowledge. So somebody can know something and yet not be able to put into words what they know. Um, if you believe that that idea makes sense, um, then it can actually give you a way of getting around the paradox, because even if you can't put into words what they know, you may be able to say a lot about what they can do with the knowledge. What what is the difference between somebody who has that knowledge and somebody who doesn't have that knowledge? Um, so, I mean, it might, for example, it might turn out that what it is it's a practical knowledge. It's knowledge how to do something.
I actually had a discussion with my younger brother. We always have these arguments
Uh,
about, does a duck know to fly south during the winter?
right, right,
Right. Yeah.
right, right.
If a duck
Well,
does know that, then it's non expressed and it's knowledge that they know without being able to express it or even conceive of it. But
Does
do
the
they know
duck
that?
have a justified true belief in what it's doing?
right. Well, it's a great example, because I mean, there's one respect in which it's a great example, and there's another respect in which it's not such a good example. The respect in which it's a great example is that it really nicely illustrates the point that I was making, because obviously the duck itself cannot articulate what um, whatever it's got. But we might well want to describe it as knowledge, and so it would be a good example of what I was talking about, because you can say what difference it makes. I mean, what is the duck able to do as a result of having that knowledge, which the duck couldn't do if it didn't have the knowledge? So,
Mm.
in that respect, it's a good example. It nicely illustrates the point that I was making. The sheer fact that the duck can't put it into words doesn't stop the duck from having the knowledge, and doesn't stop that knowledge from being really useful to the duck. Um, so far, so good. Now, the respect in which it's perhaps not such a good example is that to say that the duck can't put it into words falls short of saying that it can't be put into words.
Mm,
Uh,
okay.
And so this really, really strong notion of inexpressibility, where, you know, it's not just a question of what the duck can do, or perhaps not even a question of what a human being can do, but the idea of something that in principle can't be put into words, you know,
Hmm.
that's a more demanding
Okay.
idea.
What
It's
about?
weird. It's weird that I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Thomas.
It's weird that the duck would have like epistemological particularism and methodism and like knowledge by acquaintance. You know what I mean? I can't even think of a duck having a belief or justification for that belief. So
Yeah,
like a duck knowing it, it's more like the rules of evolution are such that this thing does this at this time. With
yeah.
us, it's different,
It
but with
is,
them,
it is,
it
it is
almost
different.
seems
Yeah,
deterministic. Yeah, with them, it
yeah.
seems deterministic. It doesn't seem as though belief even plays into it. But I could be
But
wrong.
I think what's really interesting is that both in the case of the duck and arguably in the case of a machine as well, a computer or something like that, um, it comes much more naturally to talk about knowledge than to talk about belief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I think you're dead right. You know, we'd be really reluctant to say that the duck has any beliefs about what's going on, but we might not be so reluctant to say, well, that, you know, the duck knows that it's time to head off now, or knows that it's got to go in this direction, or knows which direction to go in, or something like that. And similarly, you know, the computer might know what the product of 72 and 684 is,
Yeah.
but it would sound really strange to say that, or it would sound slightly strange to say that the computer believes anything. Um,
Well, how have you considered, for example, I'm thinking I speak two languages fluently, English and Hebrew. And also
oh,
like
okay,
I've learned Spanish in school, and there's a lot of sayings, idioms, way to say things that just never quite translate properly when you move
right,
into another language. Like for example, in Hebrew, you're pissing against the wind,
right,
or shit and yogurt. Like these specific sayings just never have the weight of them in English, for example, or vice versa. Things in English that just never make sense, or like toe the line between this
yeah,
or that. Like it just doesn't make sense when you say it in Hebrew. And
yeah,
that knowledge, unless someone is fluent in English, they just do not get it.
yeah.
Would that be unexpressible knowledge? Have you contended with these thoughts, or?
Well, I do. I do think. I do think that understanding of a language, or knowledge of how to speak a language, um, does have a significant ineffable component.
Okay.
I do think that. Yeah. Um, I mean, you have to tread slightly carefully, because uh, on the other hand, it's also language that's enabling you to express what you know. So, I mean, if you know, for example, that somebody's got to toe the line, I mean, that is something that you could know. That could be an item of knowledge, and there you are, able to put it into words,
Hmm.
precisely because you speak English.
I
And
see.
somebody else that's a monolingual speaker of another language might not have been able to express that. But it wasn't inexpressible. It's just that it's an example of something that you need English to express. And similarly, like you say, there are going to be examples of something that you can't express if you've only got English. But again, that's not going to be inexpressible. It may mean that you just have to hop over to another language. But your command of the language might have an inexpressible component, and I think it does. Um, but I'm afraid, conscious of the time. I just noticed
No,
what
it's
time
okay.
it
It's
is.
okay. It's okay. We can keep talking. This is super interesting. We can pull it a little forward. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions you want to ask, just because just always technical issues, trying new things. I posted a link in the chat that will bring you into this room. Please be mindful, don't come in yelling if you have a specific questions, and we'll have you ask Professor Moore a question. If not, we can continue talking about this. Let's stretch another 10 minutes max, and then we're gonna have to but I like this notion of inexpressible knowledge. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry, the reason that I said I was conscious of the time is that unfortunately I have
But you have to go.
now.
Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
sorry.
Okay. I see.
Well, you know that we love you, and you can come back anytime you want.
Of
really
course.
sorry about that, but I'm always up for another session at some later
Of course. Well, we'll keep a note on expressibility, and hopefully you finish that writing, and I'll read it, and then you'll come on and we'll talk more about that. Where is the place that people can find these writings that you're working on, or your past writings? Best place to find it.
Well, if anybody is particularly interested in these questions about inexpressibility, or about what I think about inexpressibility, it's in a book that I wrote called Points of View. That's the best place to look. But the very first book that I wrote was called The Infinite, and as we said right at the beginning of the show, that's one of my main interests, infinity. And actually, there's quite a bit in that book that's concerned with inexpressibility as well.
Ooh, interesting.
So one of the things that I try and do in that book is relate infinity to inexpressibility. So, that's another place that people could look if they were interested. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Again, Professor Moore, thank you so much for coming on. Thomas, thank you for joining. I know you didn't have much to say today, but everything your presence is always welcome as always. And yeah, thank you so much, Professor Moore. We love having you here.
I appreciate it, and I mean, you always make me feel really welcome, and I really enjoy these discussions. So thanks ever so much, and till the next time, I guess.
Till the next time.
Till the next time.
Great. Okay. Bye for now.
See you guys.